In medieval Italy, survival did not always come from wheat fields or olive groves. When harvests failed and trade slowed, people turned their eyes to the forests. There, inside hard pine cones, lay a food small enough to fit in a palm, yet rich enough to sustain entire communities. Roasted pine nuts were not a luxury, they were a quiet answer to hunger, endurance, and adaptation in a fragile world. In medieval Italy, forests were not empty wildernesses, but working landscapes that quietly supported daily survival. Stone pine forests stretched along coastlines, hills, and inland valleys, forming a natural pantry that required no ploughing, no seed, and no seasonal labour beyond gathering. For communities living at the edge of subsistence, this mattered deeply. When fields were exhausted, taxes were heavy, or weather disrupted harvests, the forest offered a dependable supplement. Pine nuts came from cones that matured slowly, often over several years, creating a staggered and resilient food source rather than a single fragile harvest. People did not need ownership of land to benefit from them. Access to nearby woods, sometimes communal, sometimes loosely regulated, meant that even the poor could gather food with time and patience. This made pine nuts different from grain, which depended on tools, animals, and political stability. Forest foods filled the gaps left by agriculture's failures. They did not replace bread, but they softened hunger when bread grew scarce. In this way, pine forests acted as silent insurance systems. The trees asked little from humans, yet returned nourishment year after year. Medieval diets were shaped not only by farms and markets, but by what grew untended, quietly waiting beyond the edge of cultivated land. What made pine nuts especially valuable was not their size, but their density. In a world where calories often meant survival, these small seeds carried a high concentration of fat and energy. A handful could sustain a labourer longer than a bowl of vegetables or thin porridge. For people who worked long hours in fields, quarries, or workshops, this mattered more than flavour or variety. Pine nuts delivered slow-burning nourishment that helped bodies endure physical strain. Their oil content also made them filling, reducing hunger with relatively small portions. This efficiency was crucial in times of scarcity, when food had to stretch as far as possible. Travellers, shepherds, and messengers valued foods that were light to carry yet powerful in effect. Pine nuts fit easily into a pouch and did not spoil quickly when dried or roasted. Unlike meat, they required no immediate consumption and no complex preservation. Unlike bread, they did not crumble or mould easily. Their nutritional profile matched the needs of a society where energy expenditure was high and reserves were thin. In medieval Italy, survival often depended on choosing foods that delivered the most strength for the least effort. Pine nuts quietly met that need, one small kernel at a time. In medieval Italy, roasting was not only a culinary choice, but a practical technology. Raw pine nuts contained moisture that made them vulnerable to mold, insects, and spoilage, especially in humid coastal regions. By roasting the nuts over simple heat, people dramatically reduced this risk. Moisture evaporated, shells loosened, and the kernels became more stable for storage. This single step extended shelf life from weeks to months, allowing pine nuts to be kept through seasons when fresh food was scarce. Roasting also improved safety. Heat killed insects and larvae hidden inside cones or shells, a common problem in the forest foods. At the same time, flavour deepened naturally, creating a rich, nutty taste without the need for salt, oil, or spices, ingredients that were often expensive or unavailable. The process required no specialised tools, a clay pan, a hearth, or even hot stones were enough. This simplicity made roasting accessible to nearly everyone, from rural peasants to urban households. Roasting transformed pine nuts from a fragile raw resource into a reliable food reserve. In a world without refrigeration or modern storage, such techniques were essential. Food was not only gathered, it had to be stabilized. Through roasting, pine nuts gained durability, safety, and versatility, becoming a dependable element of the medieval Italian diet rather than a fleeting seasonal treat. Roasted pine nuts fit easily into both the poorest rural kitchens and the crowded urban homes of medieval Italy. Their preparation demanded little space, little fuel, and minimal equipment, qualities that mattered greatly in cities where hearths were small and firewood was costly. Once roasted, pine nuts could be eaten alone as sustenance or added sparingly to other foods, stretching meals without overwhelming them. For poorer households, they offered a rare source of fat and energy without the expense of meat or dairy. For urban cooks, their compact size made storage simple. A small cloth bag or ceramic jar could hold enough nuts to enrich meals over many days. Unlike bulky grains or perishable vegetables, pine nuts took up little room and required no daily attention. This practicality suited city life, where food was often purchased in small quantities and kitchens served multiple purposes. Even in monasteries, hospitals, and communal kitchens, pine nuts proved useful because they could be portioned easily and added where needed. Their adaptability allowed them to cross social and spatial boundaries. Whether scattered into a humble pot of greens or folded into a more elaborate dish, pine nuts matched the realities of medieval kitchens shaped by constraint, efficiency, and careful use of resources. In medieval Italy, religious fasting shaped the rhythm of daily eating as much as seasons or harvests. On many days of the year, the church prohibited the consumption of meat, animal fat, and certain dairy products. These restrictions created a constant demand for plant-based foods that could still provide nourishment and satisfaction. Pine nuts filled this role quietly but effectively. Rich in natural oils, they replaced animal fat in meatless meals, adding body and richness to otherwise thin dishes. When cooked into sauces, porridges, or vegetable stews, pine nuts provided a sense of fullness that fasting foods often lacked. Their acceptance within church rules made them especially valuable, as they allowed households to follow religious obligations without weakening the body. Monasteries and religious institutions relied on such ingredients to maintain discipline while sustaining labor and prayer. Even outside religious spaces, families adapted their cooking habits around fasting calendars, increasing the use of nuts, legumes, and grains. Pine nuts fit seamlessly into this system because they required no special justification or preparation. Faith in this way shaped demand as strongly as hunger. The repeated cycle of fasting days ensured that pine nuts were not an occasional supplement, but a regular and predictable part of the medieval Italian diet. Medieval Italian cooking was defined less by abundance and more by careful enhancement. Most meals were simple, built from grains, vegetables, and whatever small additions could be afforded. Pine nuts played an important role in this logic of enrichment. A small handful sprinkled over boiled greens or mixed into a grain dish could transform both flavor and nutritional value. Their oils softened coarse textures, while their mild richness made plain food more satisfying. This mattered in households where ingredients were few and repetition was unavoidable. Pine nuts were not used to impress, but to sustain. They appeared in sauces, fillings, and simple pestle ground pastes that required no rare spices. In this context, value came from function rather than display. A food that could elevate basic ingredients without increasing cost was deeply practical. Pine nuts also encouraged creativity within limits. Cooks learned how to distribute them carefully, using small amounts to affect entire dishes. This approach reflected a broader medieval mindset, where resourcefulness defined good cooking. Pine nuts did not symbolize luxury, they symbolized making the most of what was available. Roasted pine nuts were well suited to the realities of medieval trade. Once dried and roasted, they became light, compact, and resistant to spoilage, qualities that made them ideal for transport across short and medium distances. Unlike fresh produce, they did not bruise or rot easily. Unlike meat or cheese, they required no salting or constant attention. This allowed pine nuts gathered in forested regions to enter local and regional markets with little loss. Small-scale traders, peasants, and itinerant sellers could carry them alongside other forest goods, such as chestnuts, herbs, or honey. Because they were not tied to a single harvest moment, pine nuts could be sold gradually, smoothing income across the year. Their portability also made them suitable for maritime exchange along the Italian coast, where light cargo was favoured on small vessels. Markets benefited from foods that could travel without complex preservation. As a result, pine nuts circulated more widely than many other forest products. Trade increased availability beyond the areas where stone pines grew, turning a local resource into a shared regional food. Mobility did not make pine nuts luxurious, it made them reliable. In a fragmented medieval economy, foods that could move easily often became staples. One of the most distinctive features of pine nuts in medieval Italy was their ability to cross social boundaries. Peasants gathered them in forests and ate them as simple sustenance. At the same time, wealthy households and urban elites incorporated the same ingredient into refined dishes, sauces, and ceremonial meals. The difference lay not in the food itself, but in how it was prepared and presented. This shared use blurred class distinctions in a way that few foods did. Pine nuts were neither exclusively poor nor inherently noble. Their presence in both humble stews and elaborate recipes reveals a rare continuity across social layers. Because pine nuts were not strictly controlled by land ownership or guild monopolies, access remained relatively open. This openness prevented them from becoming a symbol of status. Instead, they remained familiar and acceptable in many contexts. Food historians often note that most medieval diets were sharply divided by class. Pine nuts stand as an exception. They demonstrate how certain natural resources resisted rigid social stratification. In medieval Italy, the same forest-fed kernel could nourish a field labourer and grace the table of a merchant, reminding us that some foods belong to everyone. Pine nuts in medieval Italy were deeply tied to the rhythm of the natural year. Stone pine cones did not ripen all at once, and their long maturation cycle taught people patience and seasonal awareness. Harvesting followed predictable moments when cones were ready to be collected, dried and opened, often aligning with late summer or autumn labour patterns. Roasting became a seasonal marker, a task repeated year after year as part of household routine. This rhythm helped structure food preparation and storage practices. Once roasted, pine nuts were carefully stored to extend their usefulness into winter and early spring, when fresh plant foods were limited. Seasonal abundance was transformed into long-term security. These habits reinforced a close relationship between people and their environment. Food was not something taken at random, but something gathered in time. Seasonal knowledge passed through generations, shaping expectations and discipline. Pine nuts thus became more than nourishment. They became part of a temporal cycle that ordered work, waiting, and reward. In a medieval world governed by agricultural and natural calendars, such patterns anchored daily life. Diet was shaped as much by time as by taste. Roasted pine nuts tell a quiet story about medieval survival in Italy. They linked forest to table, nature to kitchen, and patience to nourishment. In a society often vulnerable to famine, war, and climate uncertainty, resilience depended on diversification rather than abundance. Pine nuts did not replace bread or olives, but they strengthened the system that sustained life. Their importance lay in being small, reliable, and adaptable. They fed the poor without shame and enriched the food of the wealthy without excess. Through them, medieval Italians demonstrated an understanding of balance between land and forest, faith and hunger, simplicity and care. Sometimes history focuses on grand crops and famous foods, but survival often rested on modest resources. Pine nuts remind us that endurance is built from many small supports. In medieval Italy, the quiet generosity of trees helped communities endure, proving that even the smallest foods can carry lasting significance.